The talk today is called Play. And in drawing play into such a serious endeavor as meditation or our lives, it strikes me that what's different about play is that we don't know what's going to happen at the end. We don't know what's going to happen next. So last night was a big football game in the nation of Spain between two rivals. And it's not the first time or the last time that they play. And not being from Spain, I can just feel the excitement from the outside. And the whole point is that we don't know who's going to win. So there's very strict rules that sometimes are followed and sometimes not. And there's a certain amount of time that's allowed. But the only reason that it's a game and the only reason that it's kind of important at all is that we don't know what's going to happen. The good guys won, by the way, in this case. When we get to be with ourselves, with our minds especially, and our emotions these days, there's a lot of visitations from the past, sometimes dressed up as the future. And we could call it the play of the mind and the play of the emotions. And that could help us kind of situate ourselves in a way that we could let it have space to go on without getting too involved. So let the thoughts come, let the thoughts go, let the emotions come and change and be strong and weak and confusing and clear. But I think it's important to notice that it's not really very playful, the thinking and the emotions. It's mostly very predictable. If we can look at the play of it, we see that it's not really playing. It's repeating. And so to decide to bring playfulness into a serious situation, where here it is, it's day 2 and I want to leave, as usual. It's very compelling, like it feels like it's the first time. And I really have to go. But just in case you weren't sure if it's your first retreat, on day 2 you're supposed to want to go. Not supposed to, but it does seem to happen that way. And so one trick is to start to be able to feel that this is repeating. It feels strong and it feels certain and it feels right. And it feels like the first time. It's a very convincing story. But there's a way of noticing the stronger and more convincing the voice in the head, the more playfulness is needed. From somewhere else. So if I'm sure, I could almost say about anything. If I'm sure about anything, if I'm sure that I'm the only one in the room that can't meditate, or I'm the only one in the room who can, or whatever. Let the certainty be an alert flag that playfulness is called for. It's time to play. Otherwise, it's not a fun game. Otherwise, it's like the emotions play with us in that way that if you've ever actually seen a cat or a dog playing with a living mouse, it's not fun. So it's not always easy to know where to find some playfulness when we're feeling a lot of fear or shame or anger, or when the thoughts are like eating us alive. And it's a little dangerous for me to give some suggestions, because then you're just following my suggestion instead of really playing. But sometimes that can start us out, just to remember the simple things that help. And one of them that we've mentioned a few times here already is when you're seriously trapped, feeling the weight of the fear, shame, anger, irritation, boredom, the thinking, something that's heavy and certain. Usually some kind of judgment involved to make it nice and heavy. Any half instant of direct experience, like green, or texture, stroking your foot if you have to, or cool. Even if there's a sound that's irritating you, it could be possible. It's not so likely, but it could be possible. Just the sound. Another game, other than direct experience, just to get you going so that you feel permission to play, to make up your own games. Is noticing that whatever the statement that's going on in the mind, so usually if there's a strong emotion, there's some kind of statement that goes with it, even if it's very deep and not very clear. And it usually has something to do with, I don't belong, or I'm unlovable, more or less. It could be more like failure. It could be more like not deserving to live, needing to earn my place by being special. Noticing that that's the channel you're tuned to, and just tuning to another channel, even if it's for 1 second. So saying different words in your mind, or knowing that there's another perspective, someone that really cares about you. That even if you're a failure, so what? Who cares? That kind of friend. There's a quotation that I really like from Einstein. And he starts to talk about mathematics, but he ends up talking about life, so just listen for a moment. if you don't like mathematics. One reason why mathematics enjoys special esteem, so special love of some people, why it's considered to be special as a science above all other sciences, is that its propositions, like what it says to be true, are absolutely certain and indisputable. So that means you can't argue with it. There's no question, there's no room for questioning. And Einstein continues by saying, whereas the propositions, so the things that other sciences say to be true, all the other sciences, according to Einstein, whatever any other science says is true, is to some extent debatable and in constant danger of being overthrown by newly discovered facts. So I noticed that when I read the dinosaur book that my son Gyan loves, that we're reading every day several times, it's only 5 pages long, luckily, I started changing the words a little bit. Where it says dinosaurs were reptiles, for example, I know that not all scientists agree anymore. And so I just skipped that part. And then it says that's why it's called the age of reptiles, so I skipped that part as well. And then it says they're the largest animals to have ever lived on Earth. And then I add, as far as we know. And he doesn't mind. The biggest one so far is good enough for a 4-year-old. So Albert Einstein says, in my opinion, as far as the propositions of mathematics refer to reality, I'll translate it into regular English in a moment. As far as the propositions of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. And as far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality. So with mathematics, unlike other sciences, unlike other perspectives and systems of knowing, what mathematics says to be absolutely true does not talk about reality as we know it. And when we talk about reality, like our living experience, we can't talk in math. And so it gives us a chance to let mathematics be. It's very helpful to know how much change we need to get, or like how many cows are supposed to come home or whatever. But a sensing of a new kind of purity, where purity is not like what's most proven or what's most easily repeatable, what would stand up in court. Some other kind of, I'm using kind of daring to use the word purity, taking it out of its usual glass box, as what's most alive, what has the most chance not to be provable, not to be repeatable, what has the most chance never to repeat itself, to be that uncatchable, unprovable, unknowable in the way that we're used to knowing. And another way to say the same thing is what has the kind of trembling, where we know we don't know, that we know we're not certain. We know that new life experience may come in and tumble everything down, and that would be fun. But it's not just like that sense of shakiness where what I think I might know now could fall down in the next second and then I'm lost or stuck again. It has something to do with the way children play, and it's fun to build the tower and it's fun to break the tower down. And when you build the tower, you know you get to break it down. And that's why it's fun to build the tower. It wouldn't really be fun to build the tower if then we couldn't touch it. That's an adult version. And it's not play. It's trying to pretend that there is an outcome that we're going to get to. And then we're going to stay there. Then we can stop. That's when we're tired. And we won't look at what's really making us tired. The movement and the learning and the growing and the uncertainty is not actually tiring. It's expecting ourselves that we should be certain and untrembling. That's very tiring. As we keep expecting, well, maybe that thought is true, and we keep acting as if it might be true. I'm a good meditator. I'm a bad meditator. So in that joy of building and destroying, in the building is we're ready. We're going to have fun tearing it down. Tearing it down, we already start to build a new one. In that not looking for the safe shell that we could then live in safely. There's a trembling. Trembling means shaking. Vulnerability. Uncertainty. Or the word that I like today is delicate. And because it's delicate, there's power. There's power. I want to read part of a poem by Mary Oliver, who's an American poetess who's still alive. And she calls the poem Mindful. And I hope this poem could help us expand our knowing of what the mind is, if this is mindful. So this is her experience. Every day I see or hear something that more or less kills me with delight, that leaves me like a needle in the haystack of light. It is what I was born for, to look, to listen, to lose myself inside this soft world, to instruct myself, to teach myself over and over in joy and acclamation. Acclamation would be like praise, appreciation. And then she goes on to say, by the way, I'm not talking about something special, I'm just talking about ordinary life. She feels she was born to get lost inside this soft world. It's an expression of this coming to our vulnerability, our delicacy, and letting there be power there. And not feeling shame about either the delicacy or the power. Logically thinking, we have every reason to be ashamed of power in human hands and to be terrified of power in human hands. But in that moment or in that space where we're lost, like a needle in the haystack of light. Haystack is a big pile of grass that will be made into a house or fed to animals after it's been cut. And it's usually like kind of golden yellow. Being nothing, in other words. In what was an ordinary world, but that is full of light. and delight. Being lost, having lost ourselves in the haystack, in the ordinary things, the sounds, the tastes, the unspeakable, simple moments of aliveness. The vulnerability is not ours alone, and the power is not in our hands. It might come through us, it might come through our hands, but it's not in our hands in that way that we have known to be dangerous, to be tricky. I'd like to start telling a story that we won't finish today. And I can't even promise that we'll finish it another day. But I'm going to start it. Once upon a time, no one knows when, not very far from here, there was a king. And he was a decent king. And one reason that he was a decent king is that he liked every evening after supper, once it had gotten dark, to dress up as an ordinary person, as not a king, and just wander out in his kingdom and listen, to know what was really going on. Because he knew that much, he knew that the people that would give him the news were not really giving him the news. So we can know that when we come to our throne in the meditation hall. Those voices in our head that are coming to give us the news, if we're the king, they're not giving us the news. If we're dressed, if we're as ordinary, we might hear something crucial, something important, something about what's really going on. So one evening he was walking, and he saw a big window with shutters, and he heard 3 women speaking inside. And the first voice, that was not such a nice voice, but was very excited, said, "Oh, how I wish I could marry the baker of the king. Then every evening I would invite my friends over, and we would have fresh baked bread and pastries for tea, maybe even supper, and it would be wonderful." And then the second voice, which was also not such a nice voice to listen to, but very excited. "Oh, how I wish I could marry the cook of the king, the head chef. Why not? Then I could invite my friends over for a delicious supper every evening, and it would be so lovely." Then the third voice started to speak, and just the sound of the voice was just melting, like some of the birds here that just can stop us. And the third voice was very quiet and said, "Oh, how I wish I could marry the king. And then I could invite all my friends to play in the palace." So the king was kind of stopped, but he didn't want to acknowledge how touched he had been by what he'd heard this evening. So as usual, he wandered a little bit more, but he was so distracted that he ended up wandering back home, trying to sleep. He couldn't quite sleep. All night he kept hearing the third voice. The first thing in the morning, as soon as it got light enough not to be too embarrassing, to call his minister to come immediately. And he said to the minister to call the 3 women, I'll tell you exactly where they live, immediately to the palace, into my presence, before breakfast. So the minister was surprised, but he did what he was told. And he brought the 3 women. And the king said, "You wished to marry the baker of the king, You wished to marry the cook of the king. You wished to marry the king. Today itself your wishes will come true. The two older sisters will marry the baker of the king and the head chef in the servants' quarters, in the part of the palace reserved for the servants. And this lovely young woman who wanted to marry the king will marry the king, will marry me in the palace this very evening. Go get ready. So what do you think happened? What was the king not so smart about? He's he said prenuptial, so he should have made a contract, signed a contract of some kind. He probably should have gotten the contract signed with the two older sisters who were, of course, going to be jealous that they didn't get to get married in the palace, only in the servants' quarters. And they didn't get to marry the king, only the servants of the king, while their younger sister is the beloved queen of the kingdom. Everybody makes mistakes, but when you're a king and you make a mistake, it has a high price. And that's as much of the story as I'm going to tell today. Or at least for now, let's see.
I'm sure it's got a happy ending though.
It does have a happy ending, but it's a long story. Where nearly everybody loses everything and gets everything at some point in the story. So just to talk a little bit more clearly about this revolution of bringing some play into the serious way that our mind plays with us. And the kind of high cost that we end up paying. When we don't take into account the obvious, like the sisters are going to be jealous. So first of all, sometimes we could recognize that we're at the end of a story. It could have been a happy story or a sad story, but we finished. So the relationship ended, the retreat ended, the time in India ended, the time in the West ended, the time in that home ended, the life of someone that we love ended. Some kind of clear ending that we accept, that we can't not accept. If we can know that we're in between the end of one story and the beginning of another, and that's a really good time to notice what our perspective is. Maybe write it down. Write down the 5 things that are clear, the 5 perspectives that you can find when you know there's an ended story and you haven't picked up the next one. A second trick in this in-between time is that often with endings there's sadness or shock or anger or all 3. And it's important to give the time needed for that process of finishing with the ending. So giving as much time as is needed for the sadness and the shock and the anger. And to also notice when we kind of fall out of those places of sadness, shock, anger. It could still feel like shock, but more like shock of the first cold splash of water in the morning. It's not so bad as we thought it would be. At least that's what I find. Thinking about it beforehand, okay, here it comes. It's much colder than it really is. And cold is also much worse than it really is. So after the second or third, it's almost like, let's have a few more for fun. If the present shock of ending is not triggering our lifetime of shock, our lifetime of defense and overprotection and over alertness, if it's just enough shock that we leave behind our usual perspectives and our usual stories, then it's much easier to feel what we were born for and to be lost in the haystack of light. To feel this kind of purity that's not pure because it's certain. It has no clue. It's not turning the mind on to figure something out. It can't quite reach the dials of the mind. But purity in that sense of so alive that it almost hurts. It almost hurts means it stretches us. Sometimes it literally feels like a stretch. Through the chest, through the throat, through the spine, in the brain. But if we could stay a bit steady and feel that this freshness, this kind of just enough shock that stretches us, there's also something that's holding us. Something. Or nothing, but there's a sense of being held or carried and stretched. There's some support and stretch at the same time. It actually goes together. We can focus on one or the other, but if we could feel for both, then it's not so scary. Then we don't go to the whole system shock, fear, defense, protection, over alert. Turning to the next shell, the next story to go into, to have something to hold on to. If we could also know that the next story is going to want to come, which means our mind is going to want to turn to the next story. And also, maybe it's going to look like a story. There might be a next relationship or a next home or a next voyage to India or whatever. A next retreat, a next meditation. Let it look like whatever it wants to look like, and don't believe the story of it. Let it look like, but don't enter the bubble of. Don't believe that you need something to protect your trembling, delicate power. Don't believe you need something to contain your trembling, delicate power. There's a teacher named Gangaji who's also a student of one of my teachers, Papaji, Punjaji. And she talks about the deep nourishment that is always present. When things start to happen again, so it looks like a new story begins. Gangaji says, our conditioning is to fixate on the objects, she calls it. to fixate on what seem to be the events of the story. The person and the feelings, the emotions, the thoughts, the words that pass. Our conditioning is to focus on the story of what seems to be happening. She's calling it the objects. And to overlook the deep nourishment that is always present. And Gangaji talks about vigilance, which is an English word that comes from a really beautiful, let's say, act or practice. It would be going with a light, a candle or an oil lamp, and staying somewhere, whether it's light or dark, you just stay with your light there. And she talks about it as something that we can't do. And she even says we can't do it as a practice, even though I just called it a practice that we can do. I like to contradict. But when we try to do vigilance, then we're stepping into the bubble of the story of I do my vigilance to protect myself, to contain this power, to not be seen trembling. Vigilance is trusting that our being is not separate from, is one with that place of deep nourishment that is always present. The trick is, and where we can be playful, where we can be unpredictable, in other words, where we can challenge whether anyone knows what the outcome, what the end of the story, when the end of the story will be. It's so predictable that when we talk about it, it seems obvious and simple and easy, and it's so not obvious at the time and simple and easy at the time. But when we get what we like, we think things are going well. So we have a meditation where we felt peace. And we think, oh good, I'm doing well. The thought is a killer. It's not that kind of killing that Mary Oliver is talking about, where every day something that she sees or hears kills her with delight. It's stepping out of the nourishment into a story. Replacing our being and then pretending to be a story. Pretending that the story will nourish anybody. Pretending that the events of the story will nourish anybody. There's something in stories that are so nourishing, I find. But when I accept that bargain, that a peaceful meditation means I'm better, or the presence or the nourishment is better or more, I've stepped into pretense. I stepped away from what I really could feel. We can tell maybe another kind of story, like, really honestly, I really love the feeling of peace. I just love it. Couldn't get enough of it. That can be true. But that when peace happens upon me, it says anything, it means anything about me, and how I'm doing, how the story is progressing. I've stepped off of my own boat. I've stepped into a protection that kills. So if we could start to notice how things always are going to go up and down, even the subtle things not less than. The tree goes up and down, the leaves come out and fall. The sun goes around, or we go around, and it looks like the sun comes up and down. The Buddha talks about the things that happen, and it's gotten formulated into these 8 items. And I think every day we could check off every 8. And so what? So we get and we lose. That happens. It doesn't need to be surprising. We get a headache and we lose a headache. We get an experience of peace and we lose an experience of peace. We get a smile from someone and then we don't. Or we get someone to leave us alone and then we don't, or whatever your thing is. So we get and we lose. And then people say nice things. Hopefully no one is saying anything to anyone this week, but in your head they're still following you around. And saying nice things and nasty things. Isn't it? Isn't it so? Success and failure. It's not really, I think they're kind of like all variations on get and lose. We get what we think of as success, and we get what we think of as failure. We lose what we thought of as success. I'm telling this list so that it's a little bit easier to notice, especially when you're between stories. And here, for example, that could be like between meditations. Or when you notice that you've been distracted and you kind of go, whoa, okay, now what? You're between stories. It can be much easier to stay out of the bubble and play with the bubble or let the bubble play. But don't let the bubble play with you in that way that it does, which is taking you into a bad bargain. Away from this deep nourishment that is. This deep nourishment that is not bigger when things go well and is not smaller when we have a hard day. Gangaji said, don't call it practice, because practice means we're preparing for something else that's real. And I'm saying, do call it practice, because it means making it practical. But make it practical for real. Not like that you'll do it better next time. So put into practice your experience and your knowing that things go up and down. And it's not in your hands. I remember when I would sit on retreats and people would do this list of 8 and the teacher would forget one of the pairs. I would never do that. And now I'm thinking that I think I forgot a pair. So we have loss and gain, praise and blame, success and failure, and just a second. So pain and pleasure, of course, is the starting point of most of our stories anyway. Pain and pleasure is especially good because we can really be simple. There's pain and we can notice how quickly the story wants to come or how much the mind wants to have a story to get away from the pain, to try to make it make sense, to kind of protect ourselves from the pain maybe. And when there's pleasure, it's like, oh, if we could only have that relief and stop and stay with pleasure. Have that kind of badge or reward. So especially noticing when there's pain and pleasure, which there's almost all the time pain and pleasure. How is it to play with kind of surfing between stories, staying between stories? Letting pain and pleasure happen. And Gangaji says, resting in vigilance. A vigilance that's not a doing, that's not a trying to get relief. It's like an honoring of that deep nourishment that I know to be. Even if I can't quite feel it or talk about it clearly right now, I know it to be. Some kind of, John de Ruyter calls it deep okayness, which I like because it's so unglorified. Whether we're okay or not, deep okayness. And it's like our light of trust, just held by that place that is not trying to prove itself by taking on the pleasure and the success and the praise. And the other one, the gain. As meaning anything. It doesn't need to mean anything. And when we notice a feeling of heaviness, which on day 2 is very likely that you do feel, Gangaji says the burden, the heaviness, is the denial of our beingness. She says as awareness itself. We could say as that place that just is nourishing. That has deep okayness in it. That we can't remove the deep okayness from there. No matter what happens. And so we can start to let our definition of mind get very wide. Because no matter what happens is a strong statement. No matter what kind of crazy, let's say like dog-like thoughts or images come into the mind. We don't grab on and try to see what it means. Because our mind is that wide. It can allow animal mind to be active. No problem. It can allow ancestral mind to be active. So really someone else's thought. Sometimes people have a little paranoia when they see how disconnected the thoughts can be, or how from out of nowhere the thoughts can be. And we want to find a reason, and so we say, maybe it was the person next to me's thought. Maybe it was the thought of the person next to me. Maybe. Maybe it was your mother, or your grandmother, or like the grandmother. Letting the paranoia take over and worrying about whose thought it is would be one way that would not be playful, that would not be fun. It could be funny, but it would not be fun. And noticing, like going back to the scene of the crime kind of thing. Going back to that weird thought that cannot have been mine. And seeing that it actually seems to have come out of nowhere. And just stop with that statement. That's true. Whether it came from your neighbor or your mother or someone in the same moment but on the other side of the planet or whatever. Maybe it was Einstein. Maybe it was Gangaji. We could feel how it's like a funny bone if we start to pick up those stories. But the real fun would be noticing that the thought at least seems to have come out of nowhere. And let that freak you out a little bit, just enough, like just enough shock, to be disengaged from the readiness for the next story. Putting into practice what you found to be true, honestly, is that it seems to have come out of nowhere. And then what? There's a kind of dread fear that our experience could be coming out of nowhere. And that one truth of what we are is that we are no thing. But if we're putting into practice, like we're sticking with our experience, the experience of no thing, there's the reaction of terror and shock, because we're trained to go for the objects, for the things. There's an experience of so much shock that there's something that usually will just as if pass out, like go blank. It's within the power of our experiencing to actually feel that happen, to know that, to kind of remember that. So anger, as if out of nowhere. We were really tired or whatever, and then suddenly, a forest fire of anger. Sometimes it could be good to hold the anger, to feel the shape of the anger, to let it float in softness, to free it from the label of anger, and see what happens. Other times it would be good to change the channel as fast as you can so it doesn't take over. And other times it could be good to recognize that it as if came out of nowhere. And it's about nothing. It doesn't mean something. It's a human experience that doesn't mean something. Sometimes when there's a friendliness in our atmosphere with the practical experience of no thing and out of nowhere, then there's not so much need to kind of blank out and miss our experience. Can take some practice, let's say. Can take a lot of restfulness. Sometimes it's as if we feel like our legs slipping into the deep, cool water. And there's a goodness. No matter what's happening. So when there's friendliness with whatever's happening, because it doesn't mean so much about me, it's not my only hope of understanding what I am and what's going on. There's more chance to, one of my teachers talks about listening for the harmony. That means listening for how what seems not to go together goes together. And when something comes in that's shocking, how much wider we can be stretched, supported and stretched, to listen for the harmony. No matter what. So to finish with some words translated by Coleman Barks from Rumi, a Sufi poet and crazy guy. He talks about being a child of this moment. I think it gives another poetic sense of not needing, let's say, past and future or even now, to let me know who I am and where I'm going and how I'm doing, so that I can protect. Beauty surrounds us, but usually we need to be walking in a garden to know it. The body itself is a screen to shield and partially reveal the light that's blazing inside your presence. Water, stories, the body, all the things we do are mediums. I'll go back and explain. All the things we do are mediums that hide and show what's hidden. Study them and enjoy this being washed with a secret we sometimes know and then not. So Rumi's saying sometimes it's easy when we're in a garden to accept that much beauty all around us without kind of passing out. Even the body hides and reveals the light that's blazing in your presence, whether you like it or not. It's blazing. It's a strong light. That means a really strong light, shining inside your presence, the deep nourishment of our being. And then he's like anything, water, even stories, even the body. All the things we do are medium, so it's a way that could show itself. Are mediums that hide and show what's hidden. Study them, so take for real your experience. Take your experience and be practical with it, so that there can be play. And enjoy this being washed with a secret we sometimes know and then not. Is there any question or comment? Yeah. The Rumi. Beauty surrounds us, but usually we need to be walking in a garden to know it. The body itself is a screen to shield and partially reveal the light that's blazing inside your presence. Water, stories, the body, all the things we do are mediums that hide and show what's hidden. Study them and enjoy this being washed with a secret we sometimes know and then not. Thank you for listening. May our lives and our practice be fulfilled here and now and in this life and for all beings.